She wasn't very pretty. Actually, she was old and wrinkled, and she didn't smell very nice either. Her hair was a little messed up, and her clothes were worn. I doubt she had ever been to a beauty salon in her entire life. Her tattered dress was muddy, and on her feet she wore a thin pair of cheap rubber shoes. But everyone outside the small country church seemed to be glad to see her. They had gathered around her and were jabbering excitedly. She had a big smile. I was only 10. I didn't see what the big deal was. Yesterday, Dad had asked me if I wanted to come with him to a church service in a country village. 10-year-old boys can always find something better to do than to go with their dad to listen to a church service. That's especially true when the only language spoken there was Korean, a language I hadn't spent nearly enough time to learn. You see, it was 1969, and my dad was a missionary church planter. I hate to admit it, but I had a hard time getting much out of church at that age, especially when my dad was preaching in Korean. Dad had taken the time to learn the language very well, including all the extra religious words and special words used in a Korean church service. He spoke it quickly and easily, and I could tell that the Koreans didn't have any trouble understanding what he was trying to say. I once asked him if he thought in English and translated to Korean, or did he actually think in Korean? He replied, "Oh, about half and half." It's true, Dad may have been a little weak at preaching, but Dad was a very good church planter, and he knew how to leverage the fact that he was an American to help build the church in South Korea. Perhaps that was part of the reason he wanted me to come with him. Maybe my blonde hair and pink skin would help bring attention to one of the projects he was passionate about. It may be hard to imagine in the world we now live in, but most of the Koreans in Dad's country startup churches had never seen a blonde-headed American boy. We lived on a compound on a hill overlooking a fairly large city, and the Koreans there had grown accustomed to seeing us, but not in the country churches and villages Dad often ministered to. Dad asked me again if I wanted to come, and was watching me make up my mind. My initial thought had been a firm no, but before I answered out loud, something had made me reconsider. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was because I secretly wanted to spend some one-on-one time alone with my dad. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. "Can I drive?" I finally asked. "Once we're out of town," he replied. Even as a 10-year-old, I had driven many times before, and I absolutely loved it. What 10-year-old boy doesn't dream of driving? I was no stranger to the dirt country roads of the Chulla province surrounding our city. "Can I bring a gun?" I asked, upping the ante and hoping to shoot a ring-necked pheasant or two, or possibly even a rabbit, as we often did. "Sure," he said with a smile. He knew me too well. He knew how to press my buttons. I was hooked, and he knew it. But now that the service was actually about to start, I wasn't too sure that I had made the right decision. I sat on the front row all alone. Dad was busy speaking softly to the local pastor, probably setting up just how the service would go. People were trickling into the church building quietly. Men sat on one side and the women sat on the other. Between them, in the center aisle, was a blazing hot coal-burning stove with a leaky stove stack. As the people came in, they were completely silent. They had done all their socializing outside and were obviously beginning to quiet their minds for a reverent time worshiping their God. As they took their seats, they would bow, fold their hands, and pray silently. These were country folk, farmers, whose average yearly income was around $50 a year. Hard to imagine. That didn't matter too much now. These people were uneducated, but obviously passionate about their faith. These country village folk would almost always stick together as a community. The entire village would be Buddhist, Catholic, or Protestant. Often they would even band together to do a project for the village, perhaps build a church or other community need. Often they would sponsor a child who had excelled in school, even putting him through medical school, hoping that this promising child would eventually be in a position to save the entire village from their poverty, perhaps even bring them one by one to America. All of this was done out of the $50 a year. Well, actually, out of $45. You see, Korean Christians don't forget to tithe. When they commit to becoming a Christian, they're all in. As an example, before a seminary student can become a minister, they have to convert someone to Christianity. This is how seriously these people take their faith. This is why that little old lady with her muddy dress had gotten up early that morning and had come over the mountain to put her few coins in the offering bag. It was a long trip, and you would have thought that the snow on the ground would have stopped her, but it didn't. You would have thought that her thin rubber shoes and cold, wet feet would have stopped her, but it didn't. You would have thought that the ice-cold wind cutting through her shabby jacket would have stopped her, but it didn't. The service began. Hymns were sung, prayers were said, the offering bag was filled, the sermon was given. I was happy when 2 hours later it looked like the service was finally wrapping up. My excitement faded when after the service, Dad announced to me that we were invited to stay for lunch. He ignored the sour reaction on my face. He could easily see that I didn't care much for that news. The pastor ushered us to a room at his house next door, and we all sat cross-legged on the floor around a low table. It was all men around the table, all men except for a blonde-headed boy who didn't want to be there, who was ready to go home. Some of the men wanted to practice their broken English on me, and to break the monotony, I was happy to oblige. After about an hour or so, the food still hadn't come. I thought I knew what was coming: rice, salted seaweed, kimchi, a fermented red pepper salad, and maybe some chicken, or if I was lucky, some thinly sliced beef. I wasn't really very hungry. I just wanted to go home. More small talk, more English practice. My legs were getting numb from being cross-legged for so long. "Dad," I whispered under my breath. He ignored me. More small talk. Finally, the rice paper door slid open, and in came the food. Rice and a few other of the regular dishes were placed in the center of the table, and each man was given a plate with a piece of fish on it. I was horrified when a huge fish head was placed in front of me. "Dad," I whispered again, "do I have to eat this?" Dad finally broke away from the conversation he was having and leaned close to me and whispered, "These people have saved up all year for this meal. This is their one big meal of the year, and they want to share it with us. They have honored me by giving my son the best piece of fish. The women are waiting for us to finish and will eat whatever's left over." He turned away and resumed his conversation. The fish just looked at me. I didn't know what to do. I tried my best to pick out some of the meat from around the edges, since I didn't want to offend anyone. I thought it might be nice for the ladies to have the rest. I didn't want them to go hungry after all. Now, over 50 years later, I look back on that day, and I can honestly say that I'm glad I endured that day with my dad. There were other days and other adventures during my time in the land of the morning calm, other days of hunting pheasants, other days with my dad, but I have to say, of all of my memories of South Korea, the memories that have impacted me in the deepest ways are those concerning the soft-hearted people of that land. I have enormous respect for the Korean people, especially those that call themselves Christians. They live out their faith in ways that we Americans only talk about. I watch them time after time living a simple, happy life in the midst of incredible poverty and hardship. Most have never owned a car. Most never even have seen a cell phone. Many couldn't read or write, but their faith was awe-inspiring. They practiced what they believed. and what they had seen in the Bible. They walk over the mountain to happily put their last coin in the offering plate. These simple but genuine people did more than just talk about their faith. They lived it.